So thank you for coming for the fourth session of these health talks, these online webinars on the gut dysbiosis series. Today we'll be discussing inflammation and disease. The first part, we will define what is chronic inflammation. The second, we will look at the role of microbiota and inflammation, and then move on to dysbiosis and disease, and potentially how to restore the gut health. Good. So these are the sessions. We started in November, where we had the overview over November, December. Then we looked at the health axis, microbiota health axis. In February, we looked at microbiota diet and disease and cholesterol, and today on inflammatory responses. So the first slide, we always sort of define and give an overview of what gut is. Okay, so gut is the gastrointestinal tract. It starts from the oral cavity. There's a hollow tube from the mouth to the anus. And in between, of course, there is the digestion of food and absorption of nutrients. And that would definitely require various organs. It requires bile from liver, which we looked into last session. Of course, the acid in the stomach, and also a lot of digestive enzymes. And then this would lead to the small intestine, which eventually will lead to the large intestine. And we will be looking mainly at the large intestine and the functions of the large intestine, also in the context of the presence of microbiota. As we indicated in the overview, the numbers of microbiota exceeds the number of human cells in our bodies, and most of them are within the large intestine. But it's not only about numbers, it's also about their function, and also about the metabolites, the substances that they actually convert from the nutrients. We looked at various functions. The main function, as we said, is the digestion of food and absorption of nutrients, but it's definitely an immune learning hub. And this is extremely important in terms of today's talk, because we will be looking at defense and the role of inflammation, which is a type of immune response. And in addition to actually defense, the immune function is also important in the tolerance of specific antigens which are present in food. In summary, it is definitely, the gut is definitely an immune learning hub. Now, it also produces neurotransmitters, meaning substances that act on neurons and therefore signal in a neurological way, and also hormones. We know that there is a number of beneficial microbiota, and we really need to keep the balance of microbiota in the large intestine such that we have beneficial microbiota. And because of this, the presence of these microbiota, there is the production of beneficial metabolites. And this is always, and the most important is actually the balance of these microbiota in terms of diversity, and also in terms of abundance. So today we'll be looking at inflammation. So first of all, I would like to define inflammation. It is a complex biological response to insults. Okay, so these are harmful stimuli, and these stimuli include pathogens. Pathogens means microbes that are harmful, and we call these pathogens. Also damaged cells, and also irritants. Okay, and this has an effect on the inflammatory process. So there is this kind of biological response to these insults. Now, inflammation is one part, one component of the immune response, and it is mainly playing the defense, okay, so mainly involved in defense against infectious agents, and also in tissue repair. Now, there are two types of inflammation. We have acute inflammation and chronic. Acute means short-term response, okay? And this is characterized by specific cells that make the innate immune system, and they recruit other specialized immune cells so that they defend, okay, and remove the pathogens, but also identify cells that are infected and also destroy the cells. Okay, so here we would have a pro-inflammatory response, and that is acute, short term. In terms of, it can also be chronic inflammation, which is long term. Okay, and this is associated, of course, as I said before, the inflammation will recruit cells all the time that will actually attack human cells that are infected. But if it is a long-term response, then there we would have also persistent tissue damage. And then we start talking about fibrosis and also dysfunction of immunity. So, and the most important point here is that acute inflammation is important, and it should be short term, okay? So that we minimize on tissue damage, but at the same time, we make sure that we are defended against the insults. So if we look at the innate immune system, is the first line of defense, various physical barriers. We of course have the skin. We also have mucous membranes, and actually we always talk about the gut lining because the hollow tube is of course external, where there is the digestion of food, but there's a lot of microbes as well, and that is a protective layer. And we always insist about the gut lining and its integrity as a defense mechanism against pathogenic bacteria. Okay? So those are also part of the defense, line of defense. Okay? But as well, it consists of various cells, as you can see on your right. We call them neutrophils, macrophages, and dendritic cells, which are important to eliminate the pathogens. Now, in addition to actually eliminating the pathogens, the harmful bacteria, which are now within the tissue, all right, they also produce a number of substances, which we call cytokines, and these actually recruit specialized cells for the immune response. And that is eventually called the adaptive immune system, which is made up of two specialized cells, which we call T cell and B cell. And this adaptive immune system actually recognizes and eliminates specific pathogens. So this is a very specific attack on the pathogen, which is at that time infecting the tissues, and also towards the cells that are infected, human cells that are infected. So one of these cells, which we call the B cell, all right, produces specific antibodies, and those antibodies are very well known in terms of vaccination. For instance, during vaccination, this is exactly what we are eliciting, an immune response without putting a really active pathogenic organism, okay, but we mimic it, and then this these cells will be activated, and that's extremely important because they will start producing antibodies, and therefore when there is the actual insult, the body is prepared for that insult, and that is the basis of vaccination. Okay? Now, the interesting part is that these cells actually have a memory function, meaning that they will remember that they actually met a specific pathogen, and therefore they are prepared for the next insult from the same specific pathogens. Okay, so that's the adaptive immune system. Together, we call this the immune response. Okay, and there is a lot of crosstalk between inflammation and immunity, and they also regulate each other. Okay? Now, the problem is when there is total dysregulation, which is something goes wrong, means something goes wrong, and can lead to immune dysfunction and contribute to the development of chronic inflammatory disorders. So that was about the sort of the definition of inflammation and why it's also extremely important. And to actually summarize all this, you always would have an initiating stimulus. Okay, it could be a gut lining which is not tight anymore, and therefore bacteria are coming in, like in the case of leaky gut, that will elicit an immediate immune response because that's foreign body and we need to attack it. Okay, and if you look at the left side of this diagram, which is the gray boxes, acute inflammation is extremely important. And in acute inflammation, there's this immune response, but then you need to go back to normal tissue and immune levels, okay? And that particular process, it's called resolution. To go back, resolution means to go back to the normal physiology.
Can you please put all the balls here? Cavalieri is just coming.
If you can switch off, if you can mute the mic. Good. Okay, so that was an immune response as well, you know. So that's why it was quite acute, short term as well. Good. So in terms of inflammation, we have also the chronic inflammation, and this would become an excessive type of excessive inflammation, long term. There's a lot of responses, and basically there's failure to resolve. Sometimes there's also failure to resolve through acute inflammation. So the word resolution is extremely important in terms of having a chronic inflammation, which would result rather going back to the normal physiological processes. It goes back towards a chronic inflammatory disease. So now the word disease will start. It's important in this particular aspect. Okay, so the most important aspect of all this is resolution, going back to normal. If it fails, it becomes a chronic inflammatory disease. And this is what we see also in colitis-associated cancer. So if you go from your left, where is this? This is the hollow tube of the colon, all right? This is where food is passing and digestion, and okay, so it's the hollow tube. As you can see, the lining is very clean and smooth on your left, but then you might have an initiation of inflammation, and that initiator, you can see the lower part, the lower left side. It could be a microbial dysbiosis. It could be microbes. It could be also drugs like NSAIDs and hormones, but it could also be stress, anxiety, and depression, which would eventually initiate, okay, a inflammatory response due to dysbiosis, so gut dysbiosis, gut microbiota, dysbiosis of the microbiota in the gut. That would result in a T-cell activation, as I showed you before. That's why I defined immunity. So there are these activated specialized cells that start attacking the normal cells, even if they are not infected now, because it is really a chronic inflammatory response. This is then called an inflammatory cascade, and it would result in colitis. as in inflammatory bowel disease, the bottom right photo. So now it's not anymore smooth, okay? There's a lot of inflammation there, okay? And that is called colitis. Colitis can eventually result in other diseases. And in fact, there is colitis-associated colorectal cancer. So what the most important part of all this is actually to restore the dysbiosis, resolve the inflammatory cascade, and prevent the colitis-associated cancer. So these are the three main factors that we do if we restore dysbiosis, keeping the gut lining in a strong shape and also smooth, of course, and with minimal inflammatory responses. We mentioned before that it is an immune hub because it's a learning hub for immunity. It's close to the environment. Immune cells are learning about the potential insults. There's always like a inflammation, but that inflammation should be always resolved as well. Okay, it's the failure of that resolution which would result in chronic inflammation. And to do that, we need to restore also the microbiota balance within the colon. So we talk about the regulation of inflammation. So as I said before, inflammation is tightly regulated and resolved in a timely manner. It's extremely important to be resolved in a timely manner to actually prevent tissue damage, because there will be tissue damage, and to go back to normal tissue state. Now, the resolution occurs due to the presence of mediators, of substances that are produced from somewhere. Okay, so these substances are called mediators to actually resolve the inflammatory process, to stop the inflammatory process, and should be short term. Okay, and these specialized pro-resolving, which means that they will act in favor of resolution. That's what pro-resolving means. Substances or mediators, there are various types. And resolvins is something that you will remember because we were going to resolve. So resolvins are a type of substances that are such mediators. And also, you might also remember protectants. Okay, so to protect from excessive inflammation. Okay? And they have a crucial role. Now, it's also extremely important to appreciate that resolvins and protectants are actually synthesized from EPA. EPA is one of the omega-3 fatty acids. And if you remember last session, we said we looked at the importance of the balance between omega-6 and omega-3 in lipids, in diet and cholesterol. But this balance is extremely important as well to resolve the inflammation quickly in a timely manner, so that it is not long term. It doesn't become chronic inflammation. Okay, hence the importance of the right balance of omega-6 and omega-3. Now these are the EPA and DHA. These are omega-3s. And omega-3s through using specific enzymes, they actually produce, it's not important, the middle part, but what they produce are anti-inflammatory. So here you have resolvins, so anti-inflammatory, pro-resolving mediators, but also they produce vasodilators. These are related to cardiovascular status. and anti-arrhythmia molecules. So they are extremely important in providing health-promoting mediators. Okay, and this is through the EPA and DHA metabolism. Okay, so the sort of changing of substances into health-promoting substances. And in fact, for inflammation is extremely important the balance between omega-6 and omega-3 because they produce different substances. Whereas if you look at the chart on the top part next to the balance, okay, that is a chart showing the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3. When we test individuals for these ratios, okay, we find that a majority of the individuals are actually in the inflammatory area. So basically a ratio which favors inflammation. Okay, so anything above 5:1 is favoring inflammation. Anything above 10 is definitely promoting inflammation. Why? Because a higher balance, a higher amount of omega-6 to omega-3. Omega-3, as we mentioned before, produces, as you know, you can see the table there, produces resolvins, which are anti-inflammatory, but also other mediators, which are anti-arrhythmia and anti-inflammatories, whereas omega-6 using the same enzymes, so that's why there is always a competition to the enzymes and the conversions, omega-6 actually produces pro-arrhythmia. It favors arrhythmia and also pro-inflammation, which means it favors inflammation. That's not an unhealthy situation if they are in balance, because we do need pro-inflammatory mediators, but we also need anti-inflammation for resolution. And hence why we always talk about a balance, the right balance between the source of anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory substances. And yes, this has, microbiota has a very important role in inflammation. First of all, as we said, they interact with the immune system to promote tolerance and also prevent excessive inflammation by producing specific health-promoting metabolites. And we mentioned these a couple of times, the short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs, such as butyrate. Extremely important, a health-promoting substance, which is extremely important as an anti-inflammatory agent, and also to induce the production of regulatory cells that resolve the immune response. Now, we know that dysbiosis or this imbalance in gut microbiota is associated and linked with various inflammatory and autoimmune disorders, such as inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, and rheumatoid arthritis. This is a slide that I used also in the overview, where I show dysbiosis and the normal balance, which we call eubiosis. This is basically importance of the ratio between firmicutes and bacteroidetes, and also health-promoting bacteria that should be, if you look at your right, which is an anti-inflammatory action with the production of resolvins and SCFA, we have high health-promoting bacteria like bifidobacteria. We should have low proteobacteria and a good balance between firmicutes and bacteroidetes. On the other hand, if there is this balance, of course, this will result in chronic inflammation. And now you can understand it's because these metabolites and these substances, which are anti-inflammatory, are actually not produced, okay, or produced at a very low amount. And because of the balance, there's always a balance, it's important, the balance of microbiota. And also now we know omega-3 is important because these substances can be anti or pro-inflammatory depending if they come from omega-3, anti-inflammatory, or they come from omega-6, which are pro inflammatory. Of course, inflammation would result in the list of diseases that you can see on your left: weight gain and obesity, insulin resistance, high fat, and gut permeability, inflammatory bowel disease, and also depression. Okay, so I'd like to summarize a bit what we've just said about the resolution of inflammatory responses. It's important to have SCF, short-chain fatty acid producing bacteria, such as F. prosnitzi, a very important bacteria that I mention all the time, but there are others. Okay, the presence of SCF phase are anti-inflammatory. It's important to have really good tight junctions so that there is no leaky gut, and therefore there is no excessive inflammation, which is chronic. Okay, it's important to have specific intake of omega-3 substances through diet or through supplementation, and that's very important because it maintains the firmicute to bacteroidetes ratios, and also, as we saw today, they produce resolvins and protectants to resolve and reduce inflammation. Okay, so this is like an image to summarize what we said today. Now, in addition to these health-promoting substances that we mentioned already, there are other microbiota, specific bacteria that are related to inflammation, such as B. fragilis is extremely important to produce a specific polysaccharide, which would induce specific health-promoting sort of cells, like what we call the regulatory T cells. These regulatory T cells are extremely important to set the tolerance of the immune response. Basically, what it does is, yes, there is an inflammation, we are learning, it's the immune hub, all right? And then there is polysaccharide A produced by a specific bacteria, and it will tell the system, this is the learning phase. Do not elicit an immune response. Okay, so that's basically what these regulatory T cells are important for. Okay, and that is through a specific substance which is called IL-10, which is triggered by a polysaccharide produced by the B. fragilis bacteria. Now, if there is lack of this particular bacteria, then we have, every time there is a learning, new learning, so the immune cells and the inflammation is on. If it's not regulated, if it is not resolved, then you have chronic inflammation, and that would result in allergies. The simplest thing is that there's a food allergy, okay? And this is because all this regulation and resolution is not in place. So just by mentioning a bit the health-promoting bacteria, F. prosnitzi, as we've mentioned before, makes up to 5 to 15% of the total gut microbiome. It ferments undigested dietary fibers into butyrate, okay, and this is an anti-inflammatory molecule. Okay? We know that that is important for the gut lining. We also mentioned in the previous session as well, Akkermansia, mucinifida, and this is important to maintain the mucin layer and also the strength of the tight junctions between the cells to keep the gut lining cells tight together so that there is no leaky gut syndrome, okay? Which would eventually result in a chronic inflammation and which leads to various diseases such as insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, inflammatory bowel disease, etc., diabetes. So, as we always indicate at the end of every session, okay, dysbiosis, we know now it's an imbalance of gut microbiota, which are bacteria, which are beneficial. And if there is an imbalance, this is associated with weight gain, obesity, insulin resistance, leaky gut, inflammatory bowel syndrome, and inflammatory bowel disease and depression. This is also set in the overview where we show dysbiosis, the problem in actually becoming leaky to different substances, increases the infection risk and inflammation. Now this box of high inflammation, now we know it even in deeper. So we looked into it, into deep information today. And also this dysbiosis is regulated by various factors. And this imbalance is due to these factors here. It could be due to aging, diet plays an important role, stress, medication, and the presence of pathogenic microbes. So these are the factors involved in this gut imbalance. Now, if we're talking about inflammation, okay, so inflammation is one part of a complex disease initiation, okay? So inflammation is important because it produces these kind of chemicals that supports other diseases, okay? And in fact, here it's a metabolite interaction slide in which we show that if there is lack of butyrate, this would lead to dysbiosis and eventually permeability and inflammation. If there is specific utilization of westernized food, particular ones that have a high content of choline and L-carnitine, this would result in TMAO, and TMAO is related to foam cell formation in vesicles, which is eventually results in atherosclerosis. And having that and having the inflammatory responses all together can lead to specific diseases such as heart failure as well. So we've would like to just revisit the importance of gut dysbiosis. And we can see that gut microbiota is a key intermediate between, of course, diet and host physiology, and results in various diseases. Okay, today we looked only at the inflammatory bowel disease, colitis, okay, because we were focused on inflammatory diseases, but all this would lead to as well metabolic syndromes such as obesity and diabetes, which we will be tackling next month. Okay, the cardiovascular diseases, okay, it's also involved in depression, anxiety, stress, hypothyroidism, and also autoimmune, which we also mentioned today as an important aspect of resolution of inflammation in the gut. Yes, we can measure dysbiosis index. This is an example of measurements which could be for a scale. In this case, it's a scale 1 to 5. 1 to 2 means it's non-dysbiotic, 3 is mildly dysbiotic, 4 and 5 is severely dysbiotic. Using these kind of tests to measure dysbiosis, then clinical studies have shown that in a healthy population, 16% of individuals have a mild dysbiosis of a score of 3. In the context of irritable bowel syndrome individuals, IBS, 70 to 80% have a microbiota profile which is higher than 2, so mild and going to severe. And in the case of inflammatory bowel disease patients, these tend to have a severe dysbiosis. So it would be 4 or 5. This is a dysbiotic index to provide information on the level. On its own, as an index, it's helpful, but it's very important to look at the dysbalance at a bacterium level. Okay, it's different species, how they vary. And that's why it's important to understand why it's a dysbiosis of 3. And then, therefore, it's important to look at the functional imbalance in the bacteria profiles. And this can be divided into various types of functional profiles. Okay, you have, as we mentioned before, butyrate-producing bacteria. Of course, low level of these butyrate producers has a negative impact on the dysbiotic index. The presence of gut mucosa protective bacteria, so bacteria that protect the gut mucosa, okay, if they are low levels, and therefore it is also having a negative impact to the index, but it's important to know what is that impact. Gut health marker, if you're just looking at, sorry, not just, but if you're looking at one type of health marker, like a Frostnitzy, then if it is correct, it has a positive impact to the index. Then there are the, like Akkermansia, you know, the barrier protective bacteria, and also the pro-inflammatory bacteria. Of course, if there is imbalance in the protective bacteria, the barrier bacteria, that's have a negative impact. And if there is low levels of pro-inflammatory bacteria, that has a positive impact on the index. So that number represents all this together. So all this is totally hidden. If you just see the number, it's important to look at the functional imbalance. And yes, once you understand what the functional imbalance is, then one can restore. And we mentioned last time the importance of restoration of the lipid profile. And today we even support that, because we mentioned the balance between omega-6 and omega-3, for instance. We support it today because that's extremely important to produce to produce anti-inflammatory substances from omega-3 sources, such as resolvins and protectants. Of course, it's important to have the right vitamins as well. So one would need to take care of to restore those levels of vitamin D3 and K2, for instance. Okay, measure the dysbiosis, as I just mentioned. So, but not only giving an index, but understanding what the index represents, so that one can actually adjust and do some interventions to regain the right balance. And therefore the use of prebiotics and probiotics to adjust levels. Eventually we'll have a session on probiotics. Probiotic doesn't only mean the bacteria that we actually intake and via the mouth, yeah, as part of our food intake. But also today we talk about next generation probiotics, which are actually the right selection of a diet plan which will increase specific bacteria in the intestines. Okay? So those are also probiotics, and important to supplement those probiotics with prebiotics, which is actually the food of these beneficial bacteria. The right prebiotics is extremely important to have the right beneficial bacteria take over any harmful bacteria in the case of dysbiotic individual. Okay? So I'll thank you today for being here with us. There is the information where you can reach me. There's the phone number. We also have a Facebook page, which is called Restore Gut Function and Prevent Disease, with a full stop in between every word. And also, I tend to put up a number of posts related to gut health, not only on Facebook, but also on Instagram. And with that, I open the discussion and just say that next time we will be looking at gut dysbiosis and metabolic disease. Thank you very much.